The evacuation order reached my comms at 6:14, station time. I was 3 minutes from the extraction point, maybe 4 if the lower concourse had taken more structural damage than the last survey suggested. I had a functioning rifle, a half-charged sidearm, one trauma kit with the antiseptic already used, and a dog tag around my neck that had been bent since coursing station 4 years prior, when a Keth fragment round had caught the chain at an oblique angle instead of my throat. I heard her at 6:15. I want to be precise about that timing because a lot of people in the years since have assumed I stopped to think about it, that I weighed something, that there was a moment of calculation in which I decided the risk was acceptable and the reward justified the cost. There wasn't. I heard a voice coming from the collapsed transit arch at the east end of sublevel 4, and I changed direction. Not slowly, not after deliberation. The way you change direction when you've walked 2 steps past something you dropped, a reflex, not a decision. The voice was speaking Vethani, which I knew well enough to understand about 1 word in 3. The word I caught, repeated in a low and steady rhythm that somehow made it worse, was the word that translates most precisely as recorded. Not help or please, recorded, as though whatever was happening to her was simply a thing she was noting down. That was my first indication of who she was. Sublevel 4 of Verath Station had been the administrative archive complex. 12 floors of cataloged transit records, interclan agreements, and passenger manifests stretching back 400 years. An archive that the Keth had specifically targeted not for its value to them, but to deny it to the Vethani Transit Authority and the 7 allied species who used those records to navigate the contested shipping corridor. When I went down the emergency stairwell at the east corner, I was stepping into what had been the most meticulously maintained library in the sector, and which was now largely a downward slanting plane of pale gray dust interrupted by fractured load-bearing pillars, and the skeletal remains of document storage towers that had once held the physical redundancy copies. The light was good. That's the thing most people don't expect when I describe it. The Keth bombardment had punched holes in the outer wall at 3 points along the concourse level, and through those holes came the white morning light of Verath's star at this latitude, sharp, almost clinical, slanting down at angles through the dust, and illuminating the archive floor in long diagonal bars. It looked like a reading room. A very damaged reading room with active artillery fire somewhere above, but the light was clean and honest, and it landed on the rubble in a way that made the scale immediately legible. That mattered, practically. I could see what had shifted and what was weight-bearing without needing my torch. She was at the far end of the 4th storage row, under approximately 2 tons of collapsed upper shelving, and a section of the ceiling that had descended intact. I knew she was alive because she was still narrating. Low, unhurried, that same word cycling through other phrases I could only partially parse. I got close enough to see her before she heard me, and I stopped for 3 seconds not from hesitation, but from the mechanics of the situation presenting themselves in order. The Vethani archivist was pinned from the hip down. The ceiling section was resting on the collapsed shelving rather than directly on her, which was the reason she was still conscious and speaking. But the weight distribution was such that if the shelving shifted further, which it would, eventually, as the dust continued to settle, the ceiling section would come down to floor level. Her torso was free. Her arms were free. Her head was turned toward the light from the nearest breach, and she was speaking in a low, methodical voice into the air in front of her, and she hadn't heard me yet. The pinning geometry was what I needed to read before I moved. The ceiling section was approximately 3 by 4 meters of reinforced composite, not original construction, but the reinforced type that Vethani transit authorities had been installing in the decade prior to the war, rated to survive a seismic event up to 6.8 on the regional scale, which meant it had come down in one piece rather than fragmenting. That was both good and bad. Good, because it had not crushed her. Bad, because it weighed close to 400 kilos and was resting at an angle on the 2 outer shelving columns, both of which had collapsed inward, one sharply, creating a wedge that caught the ceiling section's corner and was currently holding it elevated. The other more gradually, its upper surface nearly level with the floor. Senneval was in the space between them, her lower body under the gradual collapse column, her upper body in the clear. The wedge column was the lever point. The cross-member I'd freed from the document tower framework was the arm. The subfloor fitting 3 meters behind me was the fulcrum anchor. If I got the geometry right, cross-member tip under the wedge column, pivot point on the floor fitting, my full weight on the long end, I could lift the wedge column far enough to relieve the ceiling section's corner load. The assembly would shift laterally. The ceiling section would settle in a new configuration, and that would give Senneval approximately 4 seconds to clear before the new load distribution found its resting point. 4 seconds. Both her arms. Both her legs were compromised, but her arms were free and her core was functional. It was a reasonable window. I had 2 concerns. First, the subfloor fitting was slightly further than ideal for the lever geometry. The angle of attack on the wedge column would be shallower than I wanted, meaning I'd need more force to achieve the same lift. I was going to feel that in my lower back for several days. Second, I had no way to test whether the assembly would shift laterally as planned, or whether it would shift in some other direction that I hadn't accounted for, because I was looking at it from one angle, with incomplete information about the ceiling section's true center of mass. You can build a plan that accounts for everything you can see, and it's still going to have gaps you don't know about until the moment of execution. That's a feature of the universe, not a failure of planning. You account for what you can and you move. I crossed the remaining distance without announcing myself, because in a structural collapse announcing yourself sharply is how you cause vibration-triggered secondary falls. I came around the end of the nearest standing pillar and crouched to her eye level, and her eyes found mine, and she stopped speaking. The stop was absolute. Not the pause of someone interrupted mid-sentence, but the complete cessation of a machine that has been asked to halt. She looked at me with amber eyes set wide in a narrow Vethani face. The same pale blue-gray that most Vethani ran to, with the faint subdermal patterning along the temple ridge that indicated senior archivist caste. And for approximately 3 seconds she simply evaluated whether I was a useful development or a complication. I was apparently filed under useful. I said in the 3 words of Vethani I was most confident of, "I'm here, don't move." She said in accented but serviceable standard, "The order reached you." "It did." "You should have gone." "I'm bad at math," I said. "What's your name?" There was a brief pause in which she appeared to be deciding whether my presence constituted a useful input or a complication. Then, Senneval, Archivist Second Classification, Vethani Transit Authority, Verath Station. "Sergeant Dav Oren," I said. "Just the one job. How long have you been down here?" "Since the second bombardment sequence, 41 minutes. "You've been counting." "Recording," she said, with a slight emphasis that I understood after a moment. She wasn't keeping time for practical purposes. She was maintaining a record. It was, I gathered, simply what she did. Verath Station had been her station for 30 years, and if the archive was going down around her, she was going to document the process until she couldn't. I didn't say anything about that. I unshouldered my pack, took a careful visual assessment of the shelving geometry, and started working. The first challenge was the rightmost support column of the shelving unit, which had come down at a lateral angle, and was now both pinning the ceiling section above her and providing the primary load-bearing function for it. Meaning, I couldn't simply pull it free, because removing it would drop the ceiling section rather than lift the shelving off her legs. I needed to introduce a new load-bearing element before I could shift the column. The nearest option was a section of the original floor-to-ceiling document tower framework, still partially intact 2 rows over, with cross members that were rated for significantly more than the ceiling section's estimated weight. It was the right material. The problem was that it was 2 rows over. I told her I was going to move laterally along the row and that she should continue narrating whatever she had been narrating because the sound was useful to me as a bearing indicator. She considered this. You want me to keep talking so you know where I am. And so I know you're still with me. Another brief pause. That's practical, she said. Then she resumed her low-voiced narration, which I now understood was her recording the physical state of the archive around her, which documents had survived, which had been destroyed, what the damage pattern suggested about the bombardment trajectory. 41 minutes of being trapped under rubble, and she had been conducting a structural damage survey from her vantage point on the floor. I worked across to the document tower framework and started assessing what I could free without bringing the rest of it down. And I listened to her voice behind me, precise and unhurried, moving through the catalog of what Verath Station had lost. The document tower framework was bolted to the original subfloor anchors, which had held. The cross members I needed ran perpendicular to the shelving row, standard construction for load distribution in a seismic-rated building, which Vethani transit infrastructure always was. The bolts on the lower crossmember had sheared at one end from the impact load, which was useful because it meant I could work it free without tools. The other end was still seated. I worked the free end side to side, gradually, feeling the resistance in the seated bolt reduce as the alloy fatigued. This took 6 minutes. I was aware of every second of it because 6 minutes in a compromised structure with active artillery above is a long time to be making careful, deliberate movements when every instinct is telling you to move fast. I don't believe in moving fast in rubble. I believe in moving right. Senevel's voice ran beneath the work like a quiet current. She had reached the third storage row's damage inventory and was noting the survival status of the redundancy copy housing units, the physical containers that held the actual paper and ceramic documents that the digital archives backed up. Most of them had failed. A few had held. She noted each one without affect, the way you'd note a weather reading. Survived, failed, survived, failed. Partially preserved, impact damage to outer casing, content status unknown. Her voice never rose or fell with any of it. The cross-member came free. It was heavier than I wanted it to be, 15 kilos of cast alloy, 2 meters long, and awkward to carry through narrow gaps between standing shelving. But it was the right tool for the problem, and having the right tool simplified everything that came after it. I worked back toward her position, moving carefully, watching the ceiling above and the floor below in equal measure. The second challenge announced itself when I was 8 minutes into the work and had just freed the first cross-member I needed. The Keth Advance Unit entered sublevel 4. I heard them at the stairwell access points, both north and east, which meant they were conducting a floor-by-floor sweep rather than a targeted search. That was procedure for an archive complex. You sweep for survivors who might have intelligence value, you document what's been destroyed, and you secure the space against any Vethani or allied forces who might attempt a re-entry and recovery operation. They were doing their job correctly. There were 6 of them, based on the audio, and they were moving in pairs with the measured pace of people who expected no meaningful resistance on this floor. I pulled back behind the document tower and crouched low, and took a full accounting of my situation. My rifle was functional. I had 22 rounds in the current magazine and 1 full spare. The Keth sweep team had, at minimum, standard-issue pulse arms and almost certainly at least 1 crew-served weapon carried between the pairs. 6 armed combatants properly spaced, in a space where I had no meaningful cover once they cleared past the first 2 storage rows. I was not going to win a direct engagement. That wasn't pessimism. It was arithmetic. Keth infantry work in a specific pattern that I had encountered twice before. The clan organization means that each pair operates on coordinated timing. When one pair advances, the others hold to maintain sightlines, and they rotate through the advance roll in a sequence that leaves very few gaps in their combined field of attention. The gaps that exist are at the transition point, the 2-second window between one pair completing an advance and the next beginning it. 2 seconds per transition, 6 transitions before the pattern had completed a full cycle across 3 pairs, 12 seconds of partial attention per cycle. In a space with adequate cover and reliable acoustic conditions, 12 seconds is workable. In a collapsed archive with unpredictable load-bearing geometry, and the constant ambient sound of debris settling, and the distant percussion of continued bombardment on upper levels, 12 seconds is something you work with because it's what you have. Senevel had gone silent when the Keth entered. I didn't know if she'd heard them or if something had changed with her condition, and I couldn't call to her without giving my position. I pressed myself into the framework behind me and went still and thought about the cross-member in my hands, which was a length of cast alloy about 2 meters long and approximately 15 kilos. Useful for what I'd planned, also useful as a lever in a more immediate sense. The Keth pair that entered my row did so from the north end. They were moving with their lights on, which in the daylight from the breach was unnecessary but procedurally correct, and their lights swept the rows ahead of them in regular arcs. I waited until the arc had passed the section of framework I was in, then moved laterally to the next row south, carrying the cross-member. I did this in the 3 seconds when both lights were pointing away and both sets of footsteps were loudest. Keth warriors are not quiet, and that's structural, not a flaw. They're a species whose historical combat environment involved very different acoustics than a collapsed archive. I reached the next row, crouched again, and watched through a gap in the shelving as they passed. Standard Keth infantry equipment. Clan-marked vests, pulse rifles, the extended sensor cluster on the elder warrior's left shoulder indicating he was carrying the detection suite. That was the problem. The detection suite would register my thermal signature within approximately 30 seconds of me being in the same open sightline. I tracked the other 2 pairs visually through the shelving gaps. The center pair was already past the midpoint of the storage floor, moving efficiently through the ruined stacks with the focused attention of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. The south pair had split to cover the perimeter wall, which was standard for a secondary sweep of a space this size. In approximately 4 minutes, the pattern would bring all 3 pairs converging on the south row section where Senevel was. 4 minutes was not enough time to complete the extraction sequence I'd planned. 2 minutes wasn't enough time either, but it was closer to something I could work with if I changed the plan. I moved again, this time south along the row, further from Senevel rather than closer, drawing them with me. If they were doing a systematic sweep, the pair furthest from me would encounter her first. I needed the pair with the detection suite to be the one following me. What I did next is the part that some people, when I've told this story, have called brave. I've always found that framing puzzling. It wasn't brave. It was the only configuration of the problem that left both of us alive at the end. I moved toward the east breach, the largest of the 3 wall openings, making just enough sound to register on the sensor suite without presenting a clear target, and I used the cross-member to dislodge a section of standing shelving as I passed it, causing a secondary collapse cascade that sent a great deal of noise and dust in the direction of the south row where Senevel was. The Keth pair following me accelerated. The other pairs converged on the noise. I was behind the structural column beside the breach when they came through into the open area, and I had perhaps 40 seconds before the dust settled enough for the detection suite to reacquire me. I used those 40 seconds to cover the distance back along the south wall to the 4th storage row. She was where I'd left her, and she was conscious, and she had understood what I was doing because she met my eyes with an expression that I now know, from years of subsequent encounters with Vuthani people, means something along the lines of, "You are making my record significantly more complicated." "They'll converge on us in under 2 minutes, I said quietly. "I need you to be patient about pain." "I was trained in endurance documentation," she said, which was her way of saying yes. I lifted the cross-member into the gap below the shelving column. This was the critical sequence. I needed to raise the shelving column far enough to relieve its load-bearing relationship with the ceiling section without disturbing the ceiling section itself. Hold that position, and draw son of all clear with my other hand before the crossmember slipped. I had done this kind of work twice before, in Kusun and in the processing facility on Dareth, and both times I'd had a second person to manage the lever while I pulled. I didn't have a second person. When I lift, I said, you push with your arms everything you have, straight toward me. Don't try to stand. Don't try to help with the column, just push. Understood. I got the crossmember into position. I applied load. The shelving column groaned a long metallic complaint that I was acutely aware the Cuth could hear, and then it lifted. Half a centimuk. 1 centimuk. The ceiling section shifted with a sound like a slow breath, redistributing its weight to the next load point, and I pushed harder, arms burning with it, and the column rose another 2 centimuk as in son of all was pushing, her hands flat against the floor, and she moved. Slowly. Then less slowly. Then all at once, as her hips came free of the last catch point, she was out, and I released the cross-member and the whole assembly came down behind her with a crash that I was certain could be heard on the concourse level. I had approximately 90 seconds before the Cuth reached us. Son of all's legs were intact. That surprised me. I'd expected compression fractures at minimum. The Vuthani skeletal structure is denser than a human's in the lower body, adapted for the seismic activity on their humwald, and it had held under the shelving load in a way a human's wouldn't have. She couldn't stand yet. The muscle compression and the circulation cutoff had taken that from her for the next few minutes, but she could move on her hands and arms, and she was already doing it, pulling herself toward the breach. I was 2 steps behind her when the first Cuth came around the storage column. He was young. I registered that in the first fraction of a second, younger than I'd expected, the clan marks fresh on his vest rather than weathered, the grip on his rifle slightly high in a way that indicated recent training rather than long habit. He saw me and brought the rifle up, and I covered the distance between us before he completed the arc. We went down together. The rifle discharged into the ceiling. There was more dust. I came up with his rifle and his sidearm, and a cut along my left forearm from the edge of his vest plate that I wouldn't feel properly for another 20 minutes. He was unconscious but breathing. I left him that way. Son of all had reached the breach. The morning light was full on her now, white and honest and making the dust in her hair, and on her archivist's coat look almost decorative. She had hauled herself to the lip of the breach opening and was looking out at the drop to the lower external walkway, which was approximately 2 mutkas, and which she clearly understood she was not going to manage on her own. The second Cuth pair came around the north end of the 4th row, at a run. There are moments in a bad situation where the choice is narrow to a single option that you'd rather not take, but that is simply the correct answer. And you take it not because you're willing to die, but because you've already decided that the thing in front of you is more important than the thing behind you. And the accounting happens that fast and that cleanly. I stepped to the breach and I picked son of all up, both arms, full carry, her surprised intake of breath against my shoulder, and I stepped out of the opening. 2 mutkas. The external walkway met my boots hard, the impact running up through both knees in a way I'd pay for later, and I put her down against the outer wall and flattened beside her as the Cuth pair reached the breach opening above. They didn't jump. The same arithmetic that had sent me out the breach was, evidently, one they didn't find as compelling. There was a long moment in which I could hear them at the opening and feel the pulse scanner running over us. I know what that feels like, the faint surface heat of it, like a lamp held at distance. And I stayed flat against the outer wall in the shadow of the walkway overhang, and held completely still and considered my breathing carefully. Son of all was still. I mean perfectly still in a way that told me she had done this before, or had been trained for it, or had simply made the same calculation I had, and arrived at stillness as the answer. She had her hands flat on the walkway surface and her eyes open, and she was looking at the wall in front of her with an expression of focused neutrality that I would later come to recognize as the archivist's version of calm. She was recording. Even now, even with her legs still mostly unusable and Cuth soldiers 12 feet above her, she was noting things down in whatever internal catalog she maintained. The pulse scan passed over us twice. Then the Cuth pair moved away from the breach, and I heard them going back into the interior, probably to report the acquisition and wait for a larger sweep element. We had at most 6 minutes. I got us moving along the external walkway. Sandoval's legs were returning. The circulation was restoring faster than I'd expected, the Vuthany physiology doing something useful for once, and she was managing a kind of controlled stagger that covered ground. I took her weight on my left side and moved us north along the walkway toward the junction with the emergency transit bridge that crossed to the secondary structure, which was the last viable route to the ground-level extraction corridor. It was a long 6 minutes. I want to be honest about that too, because the people who imagine it as a kind of action film run have the texture of it completely wrong. It was slow and painful, and the Cuth orbital element put down 2 more bombardment rounds on the east quarter while we were on the walkway, and the second of those rounds was close enough that the concussive wave pushed us both flat against the railing and held us there for 2 seconds while the dust came down like a gruss snowfall. The railing was warm from the morning sun and vibrated with the ongoing distant fire in a way that I felt through both hands, through my knee against the deck plate, through my chest where I had it pressed to the railing's lower crossbar. 2 seconds of being held there while the wave passed. The railing bent slightly under the lateral force and then rebounded, and the sound was a physical thing that you experienced in the bones of your face before it reached your ears. Sandoval was flat beside me, her hands on the deck plate and her shoulder against mine. When the wave passed and we came back to our feet, she had a fresh cut along her left cheekbone from the railing crossbar, and she touched it once with 2 fingers, checked the fingers, and resumed moving without comment. She said in that same low, steady voice, "Second bombardment, east quarter, 2 rounds, orbital delivery, estimated yield." And I said later, and she accepted that and kept moving. The dog tag moment happened on the transit bridge. I want to place it correctly because people sometimes assume it was a dramatic gesture, and it wasn't. It was a practical one, driven by a practical concern. We were halfway across the transit bridge when I heard the Cuth sweep element moving onto the external walkway behind us. More of them this time, 6 at minimum from the footfall count, with what sounded like a tracking unit rather than a standard sweep. A tracking unit meant they had a biometric lock on one or both of us, probably from the pulse scan, and they were going to follow that lock through every structural path available. The extraction corridor was another 400 mutks beyond the bridge junction. Sandoval's legs were functional enough to cover that distance slowly, but not if she was carrying additional weight. I had my remaining rifle, the Cuth sidearm, my pack with its empty trauma kit, and approximately 11 kilos of personal load. I started shedding. The pack went over the bridge railing. The spare magazine I'd been carrying went into a side pocket she could manage. I kept the rifle and the sidearm. Then I did the accounting on myself. The cut on my left forearm had bled more than I'd registered during the run. The 2-meter drop from the breach had done something to my left knee that wasn't presenting as a fracture, but that was definitely a problem. And the concussive wave from the second bombardment had given me a ringing in my left ear that I recognized as minor barotrauma, and that would resolve but hadn't yet. I was functional. I was not going to be functional indefinitely. This is the part I have a hard time explaining to people who want it to mean something different than it meant. I reached up and unclipped the dog tag chain from around my neck. The clasp had been replaced at coursing. The original had snapped when the fragment round caught it, but the chain itself had been kinked at the point of impact, and 4 years of wearing it had never quite worked that kink out. The tag was standard military-issue pressed alloy, my service number and blood type stamped into it in block characters worn down by years of contact with skin and field dust, and the occasional entry into a body of water that regulations said I shouldn't have entered. It wasn't a meaningful object in the way people later made it. It was a piece of metal I wore because regulations required it. I pressed it into Senevel's hand. She looked at it, then she looked at me. "If we get separated," I said, "and someone finds you, this tells them who you were with. They can trace the unit. They can find people who know where we were going." She turned it over. Her fingers long, slightly tapered, the index finger calloused from decades of archival stylus work, moved across the stamped characters. She read the blood type, the service number, the unit designation. "Be positive," she said. "It's a blood type." "I know what it is." She closed her hand around it. "You think we're going to be separated?" "I think it's possible." She looked at me again with that archivist's focused neutrality, and then she put the tag in her chest pocket and buttoned it closed with the careful precision of someone adding an item to a catalog. "Oren Dav, Sergeant. Unit designation C-117. Blood type B positive." A pause. "I'm going to want to record your account at some point. Let's get to the extraction corridor first." "Obviously," she said, with a tone that suggested I had stated something mildly beneath my station. We moved. The Keth tracking unit hit the west end of the transit bridge 40 seconds after we cleared the east end. I know because I heard them and counted, and I was still counting when we came down the access ramp from the bridge junction and turned into the ground-level extraction corridor, and I could see, at the far end of it, 280 meters of straight daylit corridor under partially intact ceiling panels, the morning light coming through the panels in long slots and stripping the floor. The emergency access door that the extraction teams had designated as the fallback collection point for anyone who missed the primary lift. The door was marked with the standard emergency beacon, a small device that pulsed once per second in a bandwidth the Keth didn't typically scan. It was still pulsing. That meant the corridor was still live and the extraction team hadn't written it off yet. 280 meters. Senevel was managing something between a walk and a controlled fall, her right hand on the corridor wall and her left moving in front of her as a balance point, covering ground faster than she had any right to given what her legs had been through. I was beside her and slightly behind, watching the access ramp behind us. The Keth tracking unit would reach the bridge junction in under 3 minutes. If they came down the ramp into the corridor, this became a straight-line engagement in a space with no cover, and the arithmetic of that was not complicated. At 150 meters, I heard the tracking unit hit the access ramp. At 130 meters, Senevel's right leg gave out for 3 seconds and she went down to her knee, and I had her arm before she hit the floor and got her back up, and she said, very quietly, "Recorded," and kept moving. At 100 meters, the first pulse round hit the corridor wall behind us, high and left, which told me the tracking unit was firing at the biometric lock's location data rather than a clear visual. They could sense us but couldn't see us clearly through the corridor's interference. At 70 meters, a second round hit closer, floor level, and fragments of the corridor surface came up against my right leg. I registered it and kept moving. At 50 meters, I could see the emergency door clearly, the beacon pulse, the door's recessed handle, the faint outline of the extraction team's receiver kit mounted above the frame. I could also see that the door was on a timer. Emergency access doors in Vethani Station architecture operate on a 72-hour emergency protocol, after which they seal permanently unless manually reset from the secured side. The beacon had been running. I did not know for how long. I ran the last 50 meters. Not in an elegant way. In the way you run when your left knee is significantly unhappy, and you're carrying more than your own weight because the person beside you has run out of leg function in the final stretch, and you have both arms around her, and you're covering the distance in a momentum-forward lean that is more controlled falling than running. The Keth tracking unit was in the corridor behind us. The pulse rounds were coming in at a frequency that suggested they had a clear visual now, which meant the interference had cleared. I heard 2 rounds hit the wall to my right, and one hit the floor directly behind my last footfall, and I did not stop to appreciate how close that was. I hit the emergency door release with my shoulder at full speed. The door opened. We came through. I turned and got the door closed and activated the manual seal from the inside, which is a 4-point locking mechanism that takes precisely 4 seconds to engage, and which I completed in 3.5 by doing the last 2 points simultaneously, which is not how you're supposed to do it, but which worked. Then I stood with my back against the door and breathed. The secured side of the emergency door was a Vethani standard extraction staging area, a room approximately 10 meters by 15, bright overhead strip lighting, the kind of clean utilitarian space that had been untouched by the bombardment, because it was below the station's structural damage zone. There were 3 extraction team members in the room, all human, all staring at us with expressions that indicated they had heard the pulse rounds and had not expected the door to open again. Staff Sergeant Kellen Voss, who was the extraction team lead, and who I had served alongside in 2 previous actions, looked at me for a long moment. "The evac order went out 47 minutes ago," he said. "I know. We were about to seal the corridor." "I know." He looked at Senevel, who was now sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and had produced a recording stylus from somewhere inside her coat, and was writing on her forearm because she had nothing else to write on. "Who is she?" Voss asked. "Senevel, archivist. She was in the archive complex." He watched her write. "What is she doing?" "Recording," I said. He processed this. Then he turned to his team and started the extraction protocol, because that was his job and he was good at it, and because there was nothing else to say. The extraction took 11 more minutes. During those 11 minutes, Senevel completed her forearm record, examined her collection of it with the expression of someone reviewing inadequate notes, and then took my dog tag back out of her chest pocket and held it in her palm again. Not reading it this time, just holding it. I watched her do this and said nothing. The extraction route from the staging area ran through the sub-basement utility corridor to the station's emergency transit terminal, which the Keth had not yet reached because it was below the primary structure and accessible only through the maintenance access points. Voss's team knew every one of those points, and they moved through them with the efficient silence of people who had rehearsed the route before the bombardment started. Senevel managed on her feet for the first 300 meters, and then accepted my arm for the rest of it without comment, which I understood was a significant concession for someone of her professional bearing. We came up through the maintenance access into the transit terminal and into the morning light, different from the archive light. Broader and warmer now as the star moved higher, coming through the terminal's intact upper windows and landing on the transit platform in wide, clean panels. The terminal itself had not been hit. The Keth had not reached this level yet, which meant the floor-mounted guide strips were still lit, and the atmosphere processors were still running, and the air here tasted different from the archive, cleaner, the dust load lower, the faint background hum of station infrastructure still audible under everything. It was a strange thing to be in a working room when the rooms 3 levels above it had stopped working. The terminal didn't know yet. The extraction shuttle was there, and it had not left, and the pilot, a civilian contractor named Funna who I recognized from 2 previous Vethani operations, and who had a documented policy of waiting 12 minutes beyond the last stated departure window before she would declare a manifest closed, was standing beside the boarding ramp with the look of someone who had already made her peace with the possibility of being shot. 11 minutes past the window, she said, not accusingly, just nodding it. "I know," I said. She looked at Senevel. "Is she all right?" Sandoval answered for herself. My legs sustained compression injury of temporary duration. My records are incomplete. I would prefer to continue this conversation once we are in transit. Funna processed this with the equanimity of a woman who had spent 12 years extracting people from contested stations. Sure, she said, and stepped back from the ramp. We boarded. The shuttle lifted 3 minutes later, and I felt the station fall away beneath us in the way you feel things falling away when you know you're not going back, not grief, exactly, but a kind of weight settling, the inventory of what had happened sorting itself into the category of things that were done and couldn't be adjusted. Vareth Station fell to the Cuth in full that afternoon. I know the timeline from the official record, which was compiled partly from Sandoval's forearm notes, partly from the sensor data the extraction shuttle captured on ascent, and partly from the accounts of the 14 other survivors who came out through other extraction points in the hours before the cordon fully closed. The archive itself was gone. The Cuth demolition teams worked through it systematically over the following 2 days, and what they didn't destroy they sealed. 400 years of transit records, interclan agreements and passenger manifests. Gone. Sandoval knew this before we cleared the upper atmosphere. She didn't say anything about it. She sat across from me in the shuttle's extraction bay, her legs elevated on the kit crate that Vuss had pulled over without being asked, and she held my dog tag in her palm and looked at it with an expression I couldn't read precisely, but that I later understood as the archivist's equivalent of a long silence, the posture of someone in the presence of a loss too large to annotate yet. I had the presence of mind to let it be that. It was Vuss who broke the quiet about 20 minutes into the transit, when he came back from the cockpit with the preliminary mission debrief form and sat down across from us and said, I need a full account for the record. Arun, start from the point you heard the PFEC order. 6:14, I said. I was at the concourse level junction, 3 to 4 minutes from the primary extraction point. And you diverted to subloft 4. Yes. Vuss made a note. He was a thorough man with no taste for embellishment, which was one of the qualities that made him useful. He had a way of filling out debrief forms that was almost meditative. He looked at the form. He looked at the person. He wrote exactly what was said without editorializing, and then he looked at the form again to see if it matched the person's face and whether any adjustment was required. Usually not. Vuss's notes were the most accurate account of any action he was part of, and because of that they were also sometimes the most uncomfortable, because accurate accounts of things you've done include the parts where the calculus didn't work out cleanly. What was your rationale for the diversion? He asked. I thought about how to answer that, not because the answer was complicated, but because Vuss's form had limited space, and the answer that would fit in limited space, a survivor in distress requiring extraction, was true as far as it went without being precisely accurate. The accurate version was, I heard a voice and I turned around. Survivor in distress, I said. Sandoval was looking at the dog tag. Without looking up, she said, he heard me speaking, he changed direction. A pause. He said he was bad at math. Vuss looked at me. It's a long story, I said. He made another note. He was probably writing. Survivor located via audio contact. Diversion assessed as tactically unjustified but humanly understandable. Will annotate accordingly. That was his way. He was good at his job, which included knowing when the form's categories didn't quite encompass what had actually happened and nodding that in the margin. He asked 7 more questions. He asked about the Cuth sweep team's unit configuration, which I could answer with reasonable precision. He asked about the structural condition of the archive floor, which I could describe in the terms I'd observed. He asked about the young Cuth soldier I'd left unconscious in the 4th storage row, and I told him what I'd told myself. Breathing, no significant injury, he'd come around before the sweep element completed its pattern and would be recovered by his unit. Vuss wrote this down with the same even hand he used for everything. He didn't comment on the choice to leave him alive. That wasn't the kind of thing Vuss commented on, because he already understood the arithmetic, and it came to the same number I did. The last question was about the dog tag. He had seen her holding it in the staging room and had asked about it during the medical processing sequence. I'd told him it was an identification measure in case of separation. He looked at his notes and then looked at me and said, "It's in her medical record. The medics noted she was holding it on intake." "She can keep it as long as she wants," I said. Vuss wrote that down too, probably in the margin. We reached the secondary installation at 1340. Medical processing, debrief, the standard sequence. Sandoval went into the Vuthany medical bay, and I went into the human one, which was the sensible arrangement. And a medic named Taran, who had the hands of someone who'd done this work for a long time, cleaned the cut on my forearm and assessed my knee, and told me I'd stretched the lateral ligament enough to be a problem for the next 3 weeks, and that I should not, under any circumstances, run on it again in that period. I thanked her with the sincerity of someone who knew he was going to run on it again within the week, and preferred not to have that conversation right now. They kept me in the bay for 6 hours. At the end of the 6th hour, when the processing was done and the debrief was filed, and I was cleared for restricted mobility, a Vuthany medical coordinator came to my bay and told me, with the careful formality of someone delivering a message through a cultural context they weren't entirely comfortable with, that archivist second classification Sandoval had asked if I would be willing to receive her before she was transferred to the Vuthany recovery facility. The coordinator used the formal Vuthany construction for the request, which I later learned from a linguist carries an embedded acknowledgement that the requested party has the full right to decline. The construction itself contains the word for refusal, as though the option needs to be named before it can be set aside. I didn't know that at the time. I just knew the coordinator seemed slightly uncertain how to convey that an archivist was asking to see a soldier, and the uncertainty was in the phrasing rather than the request, as though she wasn't sure which protocol applied. I said yes. She came in with a slight fuvung of her right leg, and a forearm that had been cleaned and rebandaged over her own notes, which I gathered she'd refused to let them remove until she transcribed them to a proper record. She had been given a recovery robe in Vuthany institutional grua, and she had combed the dust out of her hair, and she looked like what she was, a senior archivist who had been through something significant and was processing it in the way archivists process things, which is to say, by taking inventory. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and placed my dog tag on the edge of the bed between us. "Your property," she said. I looked at it, the kinked chain, the worn block lettering, B positive, my service number, the unit designation. 4 years of daily wear had polished it to a kind of soft sheen on the face and left the edges matte. It was not a meaningful object. I reached out and took it. "How are your legs?" I asked. "Functional, persistent numbness in the left calf that the medical staff indicate will resolve within 2 to 3 weeks. She looked at my knee, which was wrapped. "And you?" "Lateral ligament, 3 weeks restricted movement." "We are a precise match," she said. There was something in it that might, in a human speaker, have been dry humor. In a Vuthany archivist it was probably just accurate observation. I found I didn't know how to tell the difference yet, and found I didn't mind. "I'm sorry about the archive," I said. She was quiet for a moment. This was different from her earlier silences, not the working pause of someone compiling a record, but something slower and more personal. "The archive," she said finally, "had physical redundancy copies at 3 secondary installations. The Keth knew about 2 of them, which they've presumably secured. The third is in a location that does not appear in any of the records they would have had access to." A pause. "I have the index of that third installation in my head. I have had it in my head since the second bombardment sequence, when it became apparent that the physical records were not going to survive." I looked at her. That's why you were narrating, I said. She met my eyes. I was recording everything I could while I still could. In the event that the physical record was total loss, the oral record was the fallback. Another pause, shorter this time. It is not, technically, archival best practice, but the methods available to me were limited. I thought about that. About 41 minutes of lying under 2 tons of rubble, with the ceiling section above you and the Keth bombardment running overhead, dictating a damage survey into the air in front of you because that was the job and the job still needed doing. The third installation, I said. Yes. How complete is what you have? She looked at the middle distance for a moment with the focused neutrality I'd come to recognize, and then she said, complete. There wasn't a word that would have added to that, so I didn't try to find one. She stood carefully with the slight right side favoring. At the door she turned back. Oren Dav, Sergeant. Unit designation C-117. Blood type B positive. She said it the same way she'd said it on the transit bridge, matter of fact, a record being confirmed accurate. I have formally recorded your actions today. The account will be part of the Varath Station incident record, which will become part of the Vethani Transit Authority's historical archive once the installation is reestablished. You don't need to do that, I said. I'm aware I don't need to do it. I did it because the record should be accurate. A beat. The record should be accurate, she said again, quieter, as though she were adding a note to herself. Then she left. I put the dog tag back around my neck. The kink chain settled into its usual place, the clasp resting at the back of my neck, the tag itself against my sternum with the worn face turned outward. It was the same weight it had always been. Not lighter for having been in her hand, and not heavier exactly, though there was something about the way it settled that was different from before, some slight change in its character that I couldn't account for with the physics of it. I have thought about this many times in the years since, not with any great profundity, because I am not a man who was built for great profundity, but with the specific quality of attention you give to things that don't resolve cleanly. The tag was a piece of metal with information stamped into it. She had held it because it was useful, and then she had returned it because it was mine. There was nothing in that exchange that required analysis. And yet, the extraction report listed my diversion to Sublevel 4 as an unauthorized departure from the evacuation protocol, which it was. The mission debrief listed the recovery of one Vethani civilian with information of strategic significance, which was accurate. The formal record noted that the archivist's survival enabled the recovery of the index to a previously unknown redundant archive installation, which subsequently became the foundation of the re-established Vethani Transit Authority archive after the station's liberation 14 months later. All of that is in the public record, and I am not the one who needs to tell you it. What the public record doesn't have, because there was no suitable form for it, is the sound of her voice in the dark of the collapsed archive, low and steady and utterly without self-pity, working through what had been lost while she waited to see if anyone was coming, knotting it down, maintaining the record. I have sometimes, in the years since, when people ask about Varath Station and what I did there, tried to explain what it was that made me turn around when the evacuation order reached me. I have never found a satisfying answer, because the question assumes there was a calculation and there wasn't. I heard a voice and I turned around. The voice was doing what it knew how to do in the worst circumstances it had ever encountered, and something in that was more compelling than the 3 minutes of clear corridor between me and the extraction point. But if I had to name the moment, the one I carry, the one that has the weight of the others, it's not the breach or the run or the contact with the Keth soldier in the 4th storage row. It's the transit bridge, the morning light coming through the damaged panels, Senevel's hand closing around the tag, her reading it out, B positive, as though she were taking it into the record. As though, in knotting it down, she were making it more real than it had been before. 14 months later, when the Liberation Force took Verath Station back, and the re-establishment teams went in to begin the reconstruction of the archive. One of the first things they found, cataloged and secured in the third redundant installation, whose index Senevel carried in her head from a collapsed archive floor, was the original unbroken record of 400 years of transit history in the sector. Complete. Every agreement, every manifest, every movement of every ship through the corridor from the beginning of the archive's existence to the morning of the bombardment. Nothing was missing, even the last day's records, even the damage survey from Sublevel 4, dictated into the air by a woman lying under rubble who wasn't done yet. I got a message, forwarded through several channels, about 3 weeks after the re-establishment was formally announced. It was from Senevel. Archivist first classification now, the promotion had been granted posthumously, then unposthumously, which I gather required its own administrative correction to the record. The message said, "The account of your actions at Verath Station is now formally incorporated in the archive. For accuracy, the record notes that the evacuation order reached you at 6:14 and that you arrived at Sublevel 4 at approximately 6:15. It further notes that you were wearing a standard-issue Prestalloy identification tag, unit designation C-117, blood type B positive, with a kinked chain consistent with fragment-round impact, and that you placed this item in my hand at the midpoint of the transit bridge as a contingency in the event of separation." The record also notes, because the record should be accurate, that the separation contingency was not required. I read the message twice. Then I reached up and touched the tag through the fabric of my shirt, the kinked chain, the worn face, the block lettering that she had read by feel on a bridge while Keth pulse rounds came in behind us. Then I sent back the only response that seemed accurate. "I'm glad you made it." 3 words, probably the least complete thing I've ever said to anyone, but the record had all the rest of it already, noted down precisely, maintained in a place where it would last as long as anything in that corridor lasts. She wouldn't need me to annotate it. She never did.